Hello everyone, welcome to all of you. We're so pleased to have you join us for today's webinar, Be Better at Building Tomorrow's Leaders Today, pairing the MBTI Insights with Lominger Competencies. I'm Jennifer Overbo. I'm the MBTI Brand Manager at CTP Inc., and I'll be moderating today's webinar. If any of you are new to us, CTP is the exclusive publisher of the Myers-Briggs assessment, as well as other instruments, such as the TKI, the Thomas Kilmann Conflict Mode instrument, and the CPI 260, which are used by organizations and professionals around the world to improve people performance. I'm delighted to have partnered with the team from Korn, Ferry International today to bring you this presentation. Korn Ferry is a premier global provider of talent management solutions, delivering services and solutions that help clients cultivate greatness through the attraction, engagement, development, and retention of their talent. Before we get started, I'd like to give you a little bit around the logistics of today's webinar. We will run for approximately 1 hour, but we'll reserve the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you do have a question, please feel free to pose it of us, and we will get to those during the last 15 minutes of our presentation. You can do that through the questions box feature, which should be on the upper right-hand side of your screen. We will be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar. We will also include the presentation slides. So please look out for an email following today's webinar with that information. We can also post to our website, cpp.com. Korn Ferry Lominger will post to lominger.com, so you can find the recordings and the slides there as well. So we have 3 great speakers here with us today who will be discussing the tools and how to use them in combination. First, I'd like to introduce Evelyn Orr. Evelyn is an Intellectual Property Development Director with Korn Ferry Leadership and Talent Consulting. She's the author of Becoming an Agile Leader, a guide to learning from your experiences. And she's a co-author of several publications, including FYI for Insight, the 21 Leadership Characteristics for Success, and the 5 That Get You Fired. With over a decade of experience in leadership development and talent management, Evelyn has focused on improving leaders' effectiveness through relevant and impactful experiences. Her educational background includes a bachelor's degree in psychology from Macalester College and a master's degree in education from Stanford University. So we are very pleased to have Evelyn join us. Alongside Evelyn will be Sherrie Haynie. She joins us from CTP. She is an organization and development consultant, as well as a credentialed MBTI master practitioner. Sherrie also facilitates our MBTI certification program. She has a master's degree in education, coupled with 15 years of experience as a coach, performance consultant, and learning operations director. Prior to working at CTP, she ran her own improvement consulting practice for performance. And she currently works with myriad Fortune 500 organizations. And last but certainly not least, we are very, very pleased to have Kim Kenney-Rockwal of Health New England here today. Kim has been providing human resource expertise and leadership development throughout her career for more than 20 years. Her experience spans the healthcare, manufacturing, and pharmacy retail industries. She's currently the Director of Human Resources at Health New England, where she oversees HR operations and talent excellence. As an internal executive coach, Kim supports the delivery of high-performance programs and coaching activities throughout Health New England. And today she will share with you some of her expertise with combining the MBTI assessment and Lominger Competencies to help individuals and teams flourish. So I would like to welcome the 3 of you to our webinar today. And Evelyn, I'd like to now turn the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you for the warm welcome, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to those of you who have been able to join us today. I would like to just quickly review why we're here. What are our objectives for this hour together? First, we'd like to explore how we align talent strategy with business strategy. This is something that's on the minds of many strategic HR leaders today. Second, we want to help you create targeted leadership development plans. For some reason, development planning continues to puzzle line leaders, and we want to make sure that we're, as HR leaders, we're able to keep these plans simple and very relevant to our population. Next, we want to look at how to combine the Myers-Briggs personality type with Lominger's leadership competencies to be able to impact performance. This is one way that we're really advocating today that you can make leadership development very customized and personalized for each leader. And last but not least, we want to review a real example with real results. So we're going to hear from Kim about how Health New England obtained really strong business results, in part by using the Myers-Briggs preferences coupled with Lominger's leadership competencies. Kim has a really compelling story to tell, and we're going to ask her to weave her example in throughout the presentation. So to get started with how we align our talent to our business strategy, I'd ask us to take a look at this, this image here. We all know the importance of having a talent strategy that works in concert with the business strategy in order for the business to deliver. But the challenge is that even when those two are in sync, it is the 21st century, and we have a tremendous number of external forces that are stressing the system. Whether these forces include disruptive technologies, a shift in demographics or population, globalization trends, financial uncertainty, other issues that happen in the corporate sphere. These are stressors that really make it challenging to continue to deliver on the business strategy promise. We hear these challenges show up in different ways. Business strategy challenges might show up as we hear clients say, you know, we're underperforming, or we're undergoing constant change. We're not able to keep up. We're not able to adapt or improvise quickly enough. And we may lack the organizational capability to really execute the strategy. In terms of how these external forces create challenges on the talent strategy front, we hear from our talent practitioners that we don't have enough bench strength to go around. We need to invest more in leadership development. We're not investing enough. We need to make sure our new hires are good culture fits. We're not necessarily seeing that, that we're getting good culture fits all the time, and we have a lack of the right skills. So the question becomes, how do you navigate these business strategy and talent strategy challenges while also mitigating the risk that's imposed by these external 21st century forces? One way to mitigate these risks is to ensure that the business strategy is informing and helping the business identify the right organizational capabilities. What is required in order to deliver the business strategy? Then using the corresponding talent strategy lever, how can this talent strategy support the development of the leadership competencies for individuals that will build those organizational capabilities? I'm going to pause here for a minute and ask Kim if you could take a minute to provide some context on how Health New England has experienced some of these external forces and how Health New England has made an effort to meet some of those challenges.
Sure, Evelyn, thank you. So the external forces that Evelyn referenced, in our healthcare environment, we have increased regulatory and legislative issues. And really what it comes down to is our high-performance coaching culture that enables us to become resilient against those external forces. It helps to provide that transparent roadmap for the company to strive towards a high-performance coaching culture. And it's a culture that's built upon relationships.
Great. So what we want to do throughout this presentation is really just keep us grounded in reality and the challenges that our companies are experiencing out there. Looking at the next section, how do we target our leadership competency development? Well, we know that part of the talent challenge is that jobs are getting bigger, and people with less experience are getting promoted into these bigger jobs sooner. So you can see, while there might not be much of a skill gap early on in a person's career or at the low levels of an organization, that skill gap increases as we move up leadership levels. And it becomes our job, those of us in strategic HR, to find ways to close that gap. But the challenge is, where do we begin? And if we could just raise a few questions here. this is what Kim and her work at Health New England has wrestled with, and what we at CPP and Korn Ferry wrestle with. How do personality preferences play into these skill gaps? What are the development priorities that need to be focused on in order to close the gap? We only have a certain limited amount of attention and energy we can focus, so how do we get the biggest bang for our buck? And how can you address the gap by building awareness of personality preferences, building awareness of leadership competency gaps or strengths? Again, I'm going to pause and ask Kim to tell us about the leadership gaps that you were seeing at Health New England that prompted a lot of this work that you did, pairing the Myers-Briggs personality assessment with Lominger Competencies.
Well, the gaps showed up for us as we were in the midst of adding 2 new product lines. And because the competencies that we were working on were defined at each level of the organization and integrated into the performance evaluation process, the behaviors that showed up at the leadership level, it was really about seeing the communication gaps at that level, being able to see the executive and share their thinking in that decision-making that had to be timely as we took on these new product lines and had to be consistent throughout the organization. In addition to that, we were in new uncharted territory in these new areas of product line, and the leaders needed to be able to get comfortable operating and making decisions in areas that were no longer black and white and predictable as before.
This is great foreshadowing. Those of you listening can already hear how personality preferences might be shaping these communication gaps or the decision-making styles and preferences of the different parties involved. And Kim is going to have an opportunity to go in greater depth in those examples as we get further on in the presentation. Now, Kim, she's outlined some of the leadership challenges. You just heard her outline those. But before we ask her to take that deep dive into how she used Myers-Briggs and Lominger Competencies, let's take a minute to review the 2 models that we're pairing together here today. Sherrie is going to provide a refresher on Myers-Briggs as she talks through each of the Myers-Briggs preferences. I'd encourage you to think about how these personality preferences may contribute to the strengths or weaknesses that end up impacting leadership performance in different contexts or different roles. Sherrie?
Yes. Well, as we look at the competencies necessary for a leader to be successful, and as Kim referenced, the gray areas, the Myers-Briggs Type Indicator assessment has been used very successfully during that development process of helping a leader to identify what are some of their fundamental strengths and potential blind spots. And through the lens of Myers-Briggs personality assessment, we can help leaders assist them in identifying what their inborn predispositions are, what their preferences are, and while it certainly doesn't explain all of the behaviors that one might exhibit, it gives great insight into what some of your underlying strengths are, motivations, how leaders communicate, how they make decisions, and what potential blind spots there might be. So let's look at each pair individually. We'll go through the extroversion versus introversion, sensing, intuition, thinking, feeling, judging, and perceiving. So we'll take a look first at the preference pair of extroversion and introversion. And through this preference pair, it helps us to identify where does one gain your energy. Are you energized more by people, places, the outside world, activities? Leaders that have a preference for extroversion are really energized by those conversations and the brainstorming with others and really articulate their thoughts as they're speaking through it. So they may prefer to interact with others during the process of gathering information. Through introversion, a leader that has a preference for introversion is going to need some time alone to step back, articulate their ideas through reflection. And they're energized through that inner world, the inside reflection. And by having this level of self-awareness, a leader can then take the next steps and realize not everyone is going to process and be energized in the same way that he or she may. So let's take a look now at sensing and intuition. This preference pair is focused on how you learn, how you take in information. Through the sensing preference, you're going to focus first on the details, the concrete order, observable surroundings, factual information, may relate to historical experiences. And a leader with this preference may actually, through the lens of their information gathering process, may judge others if they seem not to be on the same page. So for intuition, on the other hand, this type of leader is going to have a big picture focus. They will be looking ahead, strategy, vision, and look at future possibilities. So you can see how the two could contradict each other if they don't become aware of their differences and learn to flex to the other position. The next preference pair, thinking and feeling. This aligns very closely with how we make decisions. If you make a decision through thinking or feeling, you will need to then reverse to the other to give a balanced viewpoint when you're making a decision. But through our preferences and what we know about the theory of personality type, you typically will start with the one that aligns with your preference. Thinking, that process is going to focus on the cause and effect. Problem solve through logic, looking at the pros and cons in a very objective, analytical way. The feeling preference, this person is going to typically look at their personal values and will consider each situation depending on the circumstances and how that will impact the people affected by the decision. Their goal may be to maintain harmony and looking to make sure that all of the individuals involved, that there has been care for their future concern. So again, making sure that you consider both thinking, feeling when you make a decision, but being aware that we typically move to one preference first. The final one, how do we orient ourselves to the outside world? Through judging or perceiving. And judging, again, is not being judgmental. It's just focusing on the organization of our life, wanting to look toward the end result, enjoy closure, enjoy checking things off the list. We make plans, short-term and long-term, and feel more comfortable in a scheduled environment. Those of us who have a preference for perceiving are going to be open, adaptable, more flexible, and tend to be more spontaneous. So while we need to be able to flex to both preferences, again, we typically orient ourselves to one or the other, and having that self-awareness that not everyone will structure their lives in the same way we do helps us to really tap into the talents of others once we have our own grounded self-awareness. And I will ask Evelyn to go ahead and tie back into Lominger.
Thanks, Sherrie. I think as I was listening to you talk through each of the facets, it's really clear how certain preferences would play out in the context that Kim was describing at Health New England in terms of the additional regulations, the needing quicker decision time. And so just by building awareness of personality preference, you've come that much further to closing the gap between what is required to be successful and the performance of individual leaders. But what Kim did is she paired the personality type preference information with Lominger's leadership competencies. And let me give you a quick overview of the Lominger Leadership Architect Library of Competencies. This Library of Competencies basically represents all of the behaviors and skills that we know contribute to performance of leaders at different levels. Now, like any library, you might be overwhelmed. There's 67 competencies on this page. Like any library, you're not going to pay attention to every book all at the same time, and some are more important for certain roles than others. But this represents over 20 years of research, and as I said, they are the leadership skills that influence success. You can see they've been divided into factors, so there's sort of some themes you can think about. They include strategic skills, operating skills, which is really the execution of the strategy, courage, sort of taking responsibility and being able to stand up in tough times, energy and drive, which is really getting results, organizational positioning skills, where a person has to navigate the political structure or influence up, and then personal and interpersonal skills, which is pretty self-explanatory. On the right-hand side, you'll see two additional factors, and these two factors are the career stallers and stoppers. So in addition to the competencies that drive success, there are what you can think of as negative competencies that can derail success. So even if an individual leader has all the skills required to do a job and do well, if they have the presence of some of these stallers, they could still trip up and get in trouble. Now, as Sherrie mentioned, there's no personality preference that's better or worse than another. It's just that for each personality preference, there's an associated set of strengths and weaknesses, and it's useful to be cognizant of those strengths and weaknesses. And by translating the Myers-Briggs personality type into which leadership competencies are likely strengths and likely weaknesses, it becomes very operationalized in terms of helping leaders get very concrete and specific about what they personally can focus on to be able to better flex across preferences, so maybe operate out of preference when the situation calls for that. And this is where we'd like to drive the point home that in order to keep leadership development plans very relevant and very personalized, this is one way to customize development planning for each leader based on their preferences. So what we're highlighting here is a book called You, Being More Effective in Your MBTI Type, and it's co-authored by Roger Pierman, Mike Lombardo, and Bob Eichinger. It highlights for each of the 16 personality types, it highlights typical strengths, typical challenges, areas that type might overuse, what it looks like at work in terms of the preferences showing up in a work setting, and then it's got a tremendous number of remedies or tips on how to be more effective in that type, and then some suggested reading. So this is just one of the resources that Kim relied on in her effort at Health New England. So let's take a look at a couple of examples to make this a little bit more real. So on this slide, you can see we're contrasting an ISTJ personality preference with ENFP. And Sherrie, would you mind taking just a minute to briefly describe what an ISTJ looks like?
Sure. The ISTJ personality preference may come across as very task-oriented, seems to have a strong sense of responsibility, is going to be seen by others as having a high level of integrity, perseverance, and while that's certainly one part of who you are, your natural personality preference does not override behaviors that you choose, it can be an underlying strength or weakness if it's not used appropriately. So looking at this particular type, there are certain talents that you would want to tap into as well as potential development opportunities if overused.
Great. So if we look at it on the next slide, we'll see it in context of the leadership competencies, and you can see here that an ISTJ, while they may excel at gathering detailed information and having a broad perspective, there are other aspects in the strategic skills factor that are going to be a challenge for them. Dealing with ambiguity, managing innovation, being able to sort of make strategic judgments ahead of time. And while, again, they might be very organized and structured, their strength is not going to lie in the area of being able to develop a team, both developing direct reports and, as you can see in the interpersonal factor, being able to build a team. Again, as Sherrie mentioned, there's strong results orientation. So you can see in factor 4 here, energy and drive, being action-oriented and having tremendous perseverance is a key strength. While there might be some interpersonal or personal challenges that they need to be conscious of to overcome in terms of being perceived as being compassionate or having patience with other people. So this is just a sort of a map view of the strengths and weaknesses, and I should say typical strengths and typical weaknesses of an ISTJ. Of course, it depends on the person, but it's a good starting point for a person to build awareness from. If we look at the next type we wanted to take a look at, ENFP, if we could go back to the table. Sherrie, could you just briefly describe, like you did with ISTJ, what does an ENFP look like?
Yes, so if we're looking at a leader with ENFP preference, you're going to see the warm, enthusiastic leader, a person who's very focused on building their team, focusing on harmony, and really wanting to develop their team to the best of their abilities. So with this driving motivation of developing their team, imaginative, very enthusiastic, you're going to see a lot of warmth with this type of leader. Again, this person, this is based on their natural preferences and how they develop or how they really leverage their preferences or learn to compensate for their blind spots will depend on the path of the development that they pursue.
Great. So let's map that onto what that looks like from a leadership competency standpoint. And you can see here it's a big contrast from the ISTJ, if you remember what that map looked like. Here, ENFPs are going to have strengths in the area of creativity and strategic agility, in part because from their N and their P, they're very interested in connecting ideas and gathering information, less concerned about drawing conclusions or coming to some closure on anything. They're very open. And then in the operating skills front, while they may struggle making decisions in a quick and timely manner, they're going to have that ability to get work done through other people by developing people. They may fall down a little bit in the area of managing conflict or being really focusing on driving for results. You know, they may be more interested in the path along the way toward results. And then finally, you see what strengths they have in the personal and interpersonal areas in terms of, as Sherrie mentioned, being very warm and enthusiastic, so incredibly approachable, being very interpersonally savvy, and being able to build a really strong team. So right away, you can see how these two personality types would be tremendous complements to each other in an organization, but at the same time may misunderstand each other, or if there isn't a culture of valuing diversity, may be judged by the other in terms of what they value most. So what I'd like to do now is have Kim share two really detailed examples about how she paired the Myers-Briggs personality assessment with the Lominger Competencies as she worked on leadership development at Health New England.
Sure, if you could switch to this slide. So our work with the high-performance coaching culture began about 7 years ago, and we used the MBTI in conjunction with our coaching model. At the executive level, they took in MBTI Step 2, which was all about self-awareness. So as they've mentioned in previous slides, being able to understand yourself first before then you can begin to understand others. And at the executive team, being in a coaching culture built on relationships, before they can start to work on their own relationships and build, understanding themselves first was a big thing. And then we can begin to look at how to understand their direct reports. So the MBTI created a common language for us to be able to understand and appreciate the differences in each other, the way in which we communicated differently, and how we could communicate more effectively by knowing, for example, the difference between an S and an N dichotomy, and being able to understand that those might prefer detail versus those that link those details to the big picture. So after the leadership started talking type throughout the organization, it generated a lot of positive buzz. What were those 4 letters all about? And people started to post their types, which then what happened is created a demand for us. So we ended up offering the MBTI to all associates. And this depicts how the 16 different types are represented at Health New England, with all of our associates participating in the MBTI. So then we began to look at type as a leadership team. So looking at type by level, we started to recognize patterns At the leadership level, overwhelmingly, our preferences are ESTJ, ISTJ, as you can see. And at the associate level, ISFJ and ESFJ, with a team type in terms of the organization as ESFJ. So this helps us to identify conflicts and explain some interpersonal conflicts that may show up in the decision-making process. It takes some people more time, as we know, to process information when others may want to jump in quickly to find those solutions. But we had to figure out a way to do that that was non-judgmental in the way that we approached this that supported our culture. So we continue to educate that there is no right or wrong type, and for us, it's another element of diverse thinking within our organization. So in the example, we're looking from a competency perspective at one of the strategic skill areas dealing with ambiguity. So our leaders, as I mentioned before, have to make decisions daily without all the facts within these new product lines. And our industry is changing daily. So seeing this trend at the leadership level was an opportunity to use the Lominger U-Book in conjunction with our knowledge of type. And we needed to ask, so what are the ways that we can close those gaps individually and collectively? And the U-Book frames the competencies around type, in this case dealing with ambiguity, that displays the typical strengths. While all may not apply, it's a conversation starter around development. Additionally, it leads to a conversation about defining success. So in this case, as Evelyn referenced, not all strengths, but typical strengths that would show up as an ISTJ preference. The U-Book then goes into defining what success looks like from a skilled perspective and an unskilled. And within the executive population, their needs are much different in what they want to meet the expectations and deliver the best possible results. So having skilled and unskilled here in coaching the executive, we're able to use this language to help them see the behaviors through specific examples. As you can see the continuum here. So helping to reshape what skilled and unskilled looks like. So the goal here is to be able to give guidance in a language where that particular type can hear you best. So we're talking about an ISTJ here. So being able to communicate and focus in a way without causing this ISTJ leader to create a defensive posture, to be able to actually hear. So in this example, to get to a place where the executive can make decisions without all the facts, which, by the way, they're hardwired to refer back to. It's getting comfortable with labeling things as 25% done, 50% done, 75% versus 100% done, helping them to create a new paradigm in thinking that it doesn't have to be complete. It can be in smaller chunks to be successful. This also included a vocabulary shift from something that is perfect to changing that to something that is excellent. So again, this resource here provides those data points that can be discussed and articulated into a development plan. It really makes it real for the individual. In some cases, there are behaviors that may be overused and contribute to a developmental gap. So using the tools allows us to be able to zero in and focus on a few things that can make a huge, huge impact. In this case, for this ISTJ leader, it's about being able to practice patience and still being open to possibilities and reserving judgment before coming to a conclusion. This competency, conflict management, is in the factor of courage. And according to the Lominger research, conflict management is actually one of the hardest competencies to develop. In this case, the leader is jumping to conclusions very quickly, and the communication style is seen as too direct. So as I said, that conflict management is one of the hardest to develop, and discussing these data points helps to frame up what the behavior of skills would look like. Because it's hard to develop, you can leverage other competencies within the model that can back into conflict. So for example, listening. You can back in that way. If you have a very clear J that in all facets they're very clear and is driving to closure, but it's showing up as shutting conversations down too quickly, that's where you can back into listening so they can take the time and understand, which is an easier skill to develop, what that looks like. So really encouraging them to listen long enough so that they understand. So as I said, we've been trying to infuse personality type concepts for 7 years, and we integrated that with Lominger. Specific competencies into individual development plans. You know, at Health New England, it's about results, it's about the what we achieve, but the how we go about doing our jobs is just as important to us as the end results. And if people leave a wake in their trail of breaking relationships and damaging those relationships, then they're not going to be successful here at Health New England. It doesn't support the culture. So the how is being able to interject those competencies specific to you as an individual and leveraging that knowledge of type to do so. By educating and using these tools of MBTI and Lominger into our daily existence in support of our high-performance culture, we've knitted it essentially into the fabric of our culture. It has enabled us to create capability in others. We've become more nimble in embracing change as an organization in a time where healthcare is changing every day. It's enabled us to identify developmental areas quicker. And where the competencies tie in is it provides tangible ways to develop those behavioral gaps. And most important for us, it enables us to strengthen our relationships with each other. So this translates into higher employee engagement, continued business results, and being able to deliver on our brand promise to be personal and accountable to our members. As you can see here, the engagement impact is significant, but the business impact is aligned with that. It's focused on people quality, which represents our brand.
Kim, I think you've touched on something that is a bit of a holy grail for many strategic HR practitioners, which is transforming culture. And if we could just go back to the slide just before this, it just strikes me how when we contrast this with the picture that we put up at the beginning of the presentation, where there are all these external forces that are really bearing down and creating a lot of pressure and stresses on the business strategy being able to be executed and the talent strategy to be able to support and enable that business strategy. What we have here are a tremendous number of support systems in place through your leadership development efforts, and obviously coupling the Myers-Briggs with the Lominger competencies. And it's almost as though you have fortified and reversed and just really strengthened the organizational culture to the point where you're able to be more resilient as a business to those external forces. Is that a fair assessment?
Oh, absolutely. It allows us to have candid conversations where in most organizations they're not able to discuss the undiscussables, and it just allows us to move forward much quicker in a time of change.
And I think the beauty of it is, as I've talked with you many times over the course of the last several weeks, hearing about how the non-judgmental piece of the Myers-Briggs being filtered into developing leadership competencies. It's defensive scripts that get in the way the most in terms of building awareness. And once awareness is built and there's a feeling of support there, you've got every single member of the business is your advocate and your coach in situations because you really have everyone's back.
It does breed a level of trust to know that you understand each other and that your success is my success as a key stakeholder, and we're all aligned towards achieving the business objectives.
That's great. In fact, we got a question about how to use these tools to build trust on a team where there wasn't trust before. What would you, how would you characterize the transformation over the last 7 years in terms of trust?
Well, I do think it needs to be modeled, as most things within the organization, from the top down. By the executives working together and sharing their vulnerabilities, it almost grants permission that it's okay to talk about yourself. It's okay to talk about what you might be hardwired in terms of strengths and opportunities that you focus on. So I think that's a great place to start. In the general MBTI exercises, you don't necessarily need to talk about yourself personally first. So in the question you asked about trust, maybe they can start with just the overall MBTI, and when they get to a place where they're comfortable sharing those vulnerabilities, they've established those norms and boundaries, then maybe they can personalize it.
Great. Thank you so much for taking such a deep dive with us today on Health New England. Jennifer, have we gotten some other questions in?
We do. We've received a variety of questions. So before we jump to Q&A, I wanted to real quickly let the audience know about a few offers that we've put together specifically for those who've attended the webinar. For those of you who use the Myers-Briggs instrument, you recognize the fact that you either have to be educationally eligible or certified to use it. And Sherrie Haynie, who is one of our presenters today, is an instructor for our certification program. And CTP would like to offer to any of those who are interested a 10% discount on any of our certification programs in 2013. We'd also like to offer a discount on Introduction to Type and Leadership, which is a booklet that you can use with your employees or coachees to help them apply Myers-Briggs insights to becoming the most effective leader they can be. And I also want to make you aware of some offers from Korn, Ferry, Lominger. So they are put together a series of offers, 10% off the U-Book, which we've mentioned a few times within the presentation, as well as FYI for your improvement, and 20% off the bundle. So don't worry, we will be sending all this information to you via email along with a copy of the slides and a link to the recordings, but wanted to make you aware of those. And then I wanted to move us into Q&A. So feel free to continue posing questions to us through the box. I'm going to get through as many as I can. If your question is not answered during this portion of the webinar, please know that we will follow up with you specifically via email and make sure that we get you answers to anything that you are wondering about. So the first question I have, Evelyn, I'm hoping that you can back up for just a moment. We do have folks on the call who are not as familiar with Lominger, with the Lominger Leadership Architect product. So can you just provide a brief overview of what's included in that suite and explain how individuals can access those various products?
Absolutely, I'd be happy to. Leadership Architect, the Leadership Architect suite is one of our flagship products. Lominger established the Leadership Architect competency framework in 1991 and has continually refreshed the research around the model. So what it includes, you saw earlier the library of competencies, and that, of course, is the foundation. Along with that library of competencies, there are assessment resources and development resources. So we have a 360, which we call our Voices 360 tool, where you can deploy that through an organization for people to get developmental feedback on competencies that the organization has deemed to be mission critical for success. Then the development resource, which was mentioned in the offer slide earlier, the FYI for Your Improvement, is it's a resource book that, frankly, if you have one on your desk, it usually disappears because people find it to be very valuable. It's sort of a Bible on human development and leadership behaviors. It covers sort of what does it look like when someone's skilled in the area of dealing with ambiguity, for example. What does it look like to be skilled? What does being unskilled look like? What are some possible indicators of overuse? And then it talks about why it's important to be good at dealing with ambiguity and how to get better. So it has developmental tips and tricks as well as suggested readings. So that's a great resource. We also have a lot of data available. We like to refer to them as our placemats. They're sort of a set of information that we put onto a page that reviews sort of typical norms data. You know, are most people good at dealing with ambiguity, or are most people not good at dealing with ambiguity? That can help as you assess your own skill level, or if you're selecting or coaching someone else, it can help you put that in context for them. And because we've been analyzing what makes leaders successful for so many years, we know what predicts performance at different levels, whether it's individual contributor, manager, or executive, and those placemats capture all of that information as well. We also branch out into, you know, interviewing tools, which you can interview for different competencies that you view to be important. And so I'd be happy if anyone's more interested in hearing more detail, we can talk all day long. But you can get a lot of information on the Lominger website, which is lominger.com. And in terms of accessing the products for Leadership Architect, you can order and purchase any of the Leadership Architect products without prior certification, with the exception of Voices, in which to be able to deliver feedback for the Voices Development 360, you need to be certified in Voices to coach and deliver feedback on that. So you can look under our certifications tab to learn more about how to get certified in Leadership Architect. We call it our Leadership Architect 101 certification, which it provides a great amount of context around how to pick the right competencies for your organization and do competency modeling, and how else you can use our competency library for development. That might have been too much information.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. We've received a lot of questions, so I hope that will help clarify it for everybody. We've also received a lot of questions around how do you prepare the higher-ups, so to speak, within an organization to engage and encourage them to engage in this type of work, even if they are resistant to the idea? Can maybe Evelyn and Kim,
Yeah, why don't we tag team on this one? So my first inclination would be, you know, it's very important to frame the conversation in business terms. So when we started out the presentation today, we talked about the relationship between business strategy and talent strategy. I think that at the heart of it, business leaders know that they can't drive their strategy without the right talent in place. And so to the extent that you can frame your talent initiatives in business terms, that's going to help them, that's going to help drive that home. I think for folks who are in strategic HR, it's really important that, you know, we do our homework. We know a lot of behind-the-scenes data and research and information that we keep in our back pocket and can bring that out when it becomes relevant. And I think that helps build credibility and build the sense that we are strategic partners with the business. In terms of specifics around getting executives to get on board with either Myers-Briggs initiative or culture-changing initiatives dealing with Myers-Briggs and or competencies, I'm going to let Kim talk about her experience over the last 7 years with that.
Well, I agree, Evelyn, what you said about the business strategy, because the question that you need to really ask yourself at the executive level, is your talent strategy pushing hard enough to be able to achieve those growth goals or business goals or objectives? So, you know, that's where I would start. And then leveraging the tools, it's being able to measure the impact of the culture, because sometimes when you think about culture, it is hard to measure. Fortunately, we have things in place, for example, the engagement survey, to be able to see those levers being moved in the right direction as a result of some of the work that we've done with the high-performance coaching culture, the MBTI, the Lominger. So we've seen the dial move in terms of engagement scores. And when you think about what does engagement impact, it does impact business results in a whole host of variables. But that's where I would start as well.
Absolutely.
Great, thank you. We just received another question, and I'm sure given those who are attending and their profiles that there are others who are interested in this. Somebody made the comment that it seems like using these tools together, this type of approach, is best suited for large organizations. But they are curious about how a small startup or smaller company, maybe with less than 100 employees, might typically use this sort of approach in pairing the two assessments together.
That's an interesting observation, and I'm not sure that I agree with it. Kim, do you want to talk about how big Health New England is?
Sure. We're a little over 300 employees, and we are part of a larger health system, but pretty much we started with the FYI book, as Evelyn described, and we took the FYI books and we started to look at the behaviors that were in that book and matching that up with our business strategy. So you don't have to be a large organization. I think it actually works well in the small to mid-sized companies, because as you're identifying competencies, you know the people in your company. I know all 300 folks, and I can tell you I may have seen some of those behaviors that then I can align with the FYI book to then help personalize the development plans. So I actually think it works well in the small to mid-sized company.
The other thing I would add is that the traditional Lominger business has been very focused on equipping companies to do their own strategic HR work. So it's been a DIY model for many years. We obviously, as part of Korn Ferry, have a really robust consulting business as well. But the Leadership Architect competency library and all of the tools and resources that accompany it are absolutely easy to access and use in any context. So I actually I have close friends or colleagues who run small nonprofits with 10 or 12 individuals who are employed there, and it's very important for them to get as much out of their talent as possible while not burning them out, of course. And I am pleased that we have products and tools that don't require, over $100,000 consulting engagements to be able to access. So that's a source of pride for me in my work and what we're able to bring to the market.
Great. Thank you, Evelyn and Kim. We have had a few questions about, well, I'm going to categorize them as questions about selection. So, for example, one individual is asking about using assessments for selection and sort of the fear that oftentimes accompanies it, that there may be a legal backlash for use of assessments and selection. So I wanted to first let the audience know, for those who may be new, that the Myers-Briggs assessment is not to be used for selection purposes. So although you may learn about a team and get a sense of what may be strengths and weaknesses of that team, it's really not a tool meant to be used for hiring or selection. So I just wanted to make that clear. But now that I have, there have been some comments, Kim, based on the slide that you showed about the Health New England composition in terms of type on the leadership team. And folks are interested in understanding, given that there are few of those who prefer introversion, has that sparked any conversation within Health New England? Is that something that you're aware of, and if so, how do you address it, or is that something that you've looked at?
So the question, just let me understand the question. So because of the leadership being on the fence between extroversion and those that prefer introversion?
Oh no, I'm sorry. Sensing and intuition. So looking for more of those who may have an intuitive preference versus a sensing preference.
Well, as you alluded to, Jennifer, we don't use the MBTI in the selection process, but it's interesting because we leveraged all different types. So I think what the issue is, there is really no issue. It's really to understand what the S preference prefers and how they prefer to get the information and then use that to then make decisions. So I think where it shows up, that dichotomy, is in meetings. So you see some S preferences need more information before they can come to a decision, and it's that understanding that really promotes the awareness. So I don't see it as a concern for the organization. Yeah. But we are very mindful of the dichotomies on different teams and within the organization.
If I could just comment on the topic briefly, you know, I think it's external selection and hiring is one thing, and internal placement and creating teams is another thing. And I think with external hiring, certainly, you know, not using Myers-Briggs as a source, but understanding that there is typically a similar to me bias where you may end up inadvertently sort of reinforcing the cultural majority preferences of an organization. It's just helpful to be cognizant that that's one bias that enters into interviewing. And for that reason, a structured interviewing tool that helps you identify which competencies, and you can even do the analysis ahead of time, because on which competencies you have a gap in as a company or as a team, and when you're bringing someone on, you prioritize those, or maybe you do success profiling or competency modeling to address which competencies are going to be mission critical for success in that role. And we do have an interview tool that it's not an online assessment or anything, but we do have an interview tool that allows interviewers to use the skilled and unskilled definitions and a set of key questions and structured probes to assess for the purpose of selection.
And Evelyn, if I could just piggyback on what you said, we actually use the interview architect because culture is so important to us, and we look for not only the functional technical skills of the role, we've added competencies into all of our role descriptions. And when we're interviewing for an opportunity, we also interject some of those, as you've alluded to, those mission critical competencies to help complement the team for that person in the role. So we actually evaluate people on the competencies in the interview process.
That's great.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. It looks like we are just about out of time, and I will tell you we've received a ton of questions. So for those of you who did not have your question answered, I'm just going to remind you that we will follow up with you individually via email. We will also be emailing out the copy of the presentation as well as a link to the recordings. So I just want to thank our speakers for their time today in putting together such a fantastic presentation. It looks like it really did hit a lot of buttons with our audience, and they were very interactive, posting a lot of different questions and comments throughout. So thank you very much. And for those of you who did attend, as we close out the webinar, we will be asking you to complete a very brief survey, but we do hope that you'll take the time to do it. Let us know how we can improve or add new content to answer your questions next time. So thank you once again. I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and come back and join us for our next webinars. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody.